Hey guys, tonight we follow a man who came from the narrow streets of Palermo, Sicily, and quietly became one of the most powerful crime bosses in American history. He didn't just survive the Mafia life, he mastered it, climbing from an unknown immigrant to the undisputed head of the Gambino crime family. We're talking about Carlo Gambino, the boss of bosses, whose reign lasted decades without him ever spending a single night in prison. Picture this, it's the 1950s. New York is a city divided among the five families, each hungry for control over unions, shipping, construction, and the streets themselves. While other mobsters craved fame and feared betrayal, Carlo played the long game. He moved quietly, always in the shadows, making decisions that shaped the underworld while keeping his name out of the papers. He was the man who controlled it all without ever needing to raise his voice. You might think this is just a story about organized crime, but it's really about patience, strategy, and the power of staying invisible while controlling everything. It's about how one man built an empire so steady, even law enforcement couldn't touch him, and how he became the most respected figure in the Mafia without ever firing a shot in anger. So, before we dive in, hit that like button if you enjoy these late-night mob tales, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and follow me into the quiet but unshakable empire of Carlo Gambino, the man who proved that in the mob, the smartest voice is often the quietest one. The story of Carlo Gambino doesn't begin with the image most people have of a mafia boss. It doesn't start with a tailored suit, a smoke-filled room, or a whispered command that changes the fate of a man in an instant. Instead, it begins far away from New York, across the Atlantic, under the warm Sicilian sun, in a place where the cobblestone streets twisted like old memories, and the scent of bread drifted from open kitchen windows. Carlo was born on August 24, 1902, in the small fishing village of Cacamo, Sicily. Life here wasn't fast. It moved with the rhythm of the land and the sea. Men rose before the sun, women prepared meals that told stories of their ancestors, and children played in narrow alleyways where history lingered in every stone. But beneath the calm surface of village life, there was another world, one of quiet arrangements, unspoken rules, and alliances that could shape a man's destiny without a single public word being spoken. Carlo grew up in a household that understood those rules. His family wasn't wealthy, but they carried a certain respect in the village, a respect that didn't come from money alone. In Sicily, respect was often earned through influence, and influence came from knowing when to act and when to remain silent. That lesson would shape Carlo's entire life. As a boy, Carlo wasn't loud or boisterous. While other children tried to prove themselves with bold games or loud challenges, Carlo stood back and watched. He observed who people trusted, who they feared, and who quietly held power in the background. It was in those years that he began to understand that strength wasn't always about force. Sometimes it was about patience. By the time he reached his teenage years, the winds of change were sweeping across Italy. Political tensions, economic hardship, and shifting allegiances created an environment where opportunities and dangers were often the same thing. Many young men looked toward America, that distant land where streets were said to be paved with gold and fortunes could be made if you were willing to work hard enough. But for some, America offered more than just honest labor. It offered a chance to build something that could last, away from the watchful eyes of the old country. Carlo was just 19 years old when he made the decision to leave. In 1921, with little more than determination in his pocket, he boarded a ship bound for the United States. The journey across the Atlantic was not glamorous. The air in the lower decks was thick, the days were long, and the nights were filled with the quiet murmur of passengers dreaming about what awaited them on the other side. Carlo kept to himself as he often did, speaking little but watching everything. When the ship finally reached New York Harbor, the sight of the city must have been overwhelming. Towering buildings, busy streets, the constant hum of life. But Carlo wasn't dazzled in the way some newcomers were. He didn't rush to take it all in. He studied it instead, noting the way people moved, the rhythm of the streets, and the undercurrent of opportunity that ran through it all. Carlo settled in Brooklyn, an area where many Italian immigrants had made their home. The streets here were alive with the sounds of the old country, conversations in Sicilian dialect, music drifting from open windows, the smell of cooking that reminded people of home. But just like in Sicily, there was another world beneath the surface. Neighborhoods were watched over by men who didn't wear badges but whose authority was unquestioned. Disputes were settled quietly, and certain businesses thrived under arrangements that kept everyone satisfied, as long as you knew the rules. Carlo began working in small jobs, always keeping a low profile. He was polite, dependable, and never drew unnecessary attention to himself. But in these neighborhoods, the right people noticed. Men who mattered began to see that this young Sicilian had something rare: the ability to stay calm, listen more than he spoke, and act decisively when the moment came. In those early years, prohibition was in full swing. From 1920 to 1933, the sale and distribution of alcohol was illegal in the United States, a law that created one of the most profitable underground industries in history. In the backrooms of Brooklyn, in warehouses along the waterfront, deals were made to smuggle, store, and distribute liquor. It was dangerous work, but for those willing to take the risk, the rewards were significant. Carlo found his way into this world not through bluster, but through reliability. He could be trusted to handle deliveries, manage shipments, and keep his mouth shut. An invaluable quality in a business where loose talk could sink more than just a deal. Slowly, he became connected to more influential figures, including members of the Mangano crime family, which would one day become the Gambino family. The early days in Brooklyn were a test of character. Carlo saw men rise and fall quickly, some because they were reckless, others because they couldn't resist the temptation to show off their success. Carlo did neither. He lived modestly, kept his circle small, and made sure that his reputation was built on dependability rather than intimidation. It was during this time that he began to form relationships that would shape his future. He aligned himself with men who valued discretion as much as ambition, men who understood that the quiet player often had the longest game. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but when he spoke, people listened, not because he demanded it, but because they knew his words were measured and deliberate. As the years passed, Carlo's role in the underworld deepened. He wasn't yet a boss, or even close to one, but he had positioned himself carefully, avoiding unnecessary risks while building a network of allies. The streets of Brooklyn could be unforgiving, but they also rewarded those who understood timing. Carlo never pushed too far, too fast. He moved like the tide, steady, inevitable, and difficult to stop once in motion. By the late 1920s, his connections extended beyond Brooklyn. He was working with crews that had ties to Manhattan and even other cities, quietly expanding his reach without ever making himself a target. The landscape of organized crime was shifting. New alliances were forming, old rivalries were heating up, and the men who could adapt were the ones who would survive. For Carlo Gambino, survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about positioning himself so that when opportunities came, he would be ready to step forward without hesitation. He knew that in this world the spotlight was dangerous. Better to let others take the public glory while you worked behind the scenes, unseen but essential. And so, in the quiet streets of Brooklyn, the young man from Caccamo was laying the foundation for a future no one could yet see. A future in which his name would be spoken with a mix of respect, caution, and quiet awe. The next chapter of his life would take him deeper into the heart of the American underworld, but his greatest strength would remain the same as it had been since his childhood in Sicily: the understanding that true power often works in silence. The early 1930s in New York were a time of transition. The city was still in the grip of the Great Depression, but its streets pulsed with the same restless energy that had always defined it. For the men operating in the shadows, this was both a time of danger and opportunity. The law was cracking down on Prohibition-era operations, rival crews fought for territory, and whispers of shifting power structures spread quietly from one neighborhood to another. Carlo Gambino, still in his late 20s, had learned to navigate this world with care. He had made connections that mattered, not the flashy kind that brought attention, but the subtle bonds of trust that could mean the difference between survival and ruin. He had spent the last several years proving his reliability to the right people. His name wasn't one the newspapers knew, and that was exactly how he liked it. When Prohibition ended in 1933, many saw it as the end of an era. For those who had made fortunes smuggling liquor, it meant losing a profitable market overnight. Some men tried to hold on to the trade, but without the law forbidding alcohol, the underground profits shrank quickly. Those who couldn't adapt were left scrambling. Carlo didn't cling to the past. He saw the change coming and began shifting his focus to other ventures long before the last barrel of bootleg whiskey had been sold. In Brooklyn, there were always ways to make money if you understood the currents. Gambling, loan operations, and union connections were becoming increasingly important. Labor unions held influence over industries from the docks to construction, and with influence came the ability to negotiate, delay, or speed up work, all valuable in the right hands. By the mid-1930s, Carlo had moved deeper into the world of labor racketeering. The Brooklyn waterfront was a world of its own. Ships from all over the world docked there, unloading goods that fed the city's markets. Controlling the flow of those goods meant controlling a great deal of money. Dock workers were hard men who respected strength but valued fairness. Carlo wasn't the type to shout orders or throw his weight around unnecessarily, but he knew how to build loyalty. He made sure the right people were taken care of, disputes were settled quietly, and everyone understood that as long as things ran smoothly, everyone could benefit. It was in these years that Carlo began to develop a reputation not just as a man who could be trusted, but as someone who thought long-term. Many men in the underworld looked only at the next score or the next deal. Carlo thought in decades. He didn't rush, and he didn't take unnecessary chances. His moves were deliberate, and he rarely allowed emotion to dictate his actions. This approach earned him the respect of another man who would become central to his rise. Vincent Mangano, the head of what was then known as the Mangano crime family. The family operated primarily in Brooklyn and had deep connections to the docks, construction, and trucking industries. Mangano valued men who could handle business without drawing attention, and Carlo fit the role perfectly. Working under the Mangano organization, Carlo continued to expand his influence on the waterfront. He wasn't the boss, far from it, but he was becoming a figure whose approval carried weight. In a world where alliances could shift overnight, Carlo made sure his relationships were stable and mutually beneficial. At the same time, he cultivated an image that would follow him for the rest of his life. While other men flaunted their wealth with expensive cars, flashy suits, and public displays, Carlo preferred simplicity. He dressed neatly but modestly, drove unremarkable cars, and kept his personal life private. He lived in the same modest house in Brooklyn for decades, never giving the impression that he was anything more than a hard-working immigrant who valued family and stability. But beneath that modest image was a man whose network stretched far beyond what most people realized. By the late 1930s, he had quiet connections to other families in New York and beyond. He understood that power didn't always come from being in charge. Sometimes it came from being the person others turned to when they needed something handled discreetly. The world outside was changing quickly. The end of the decade brought the approach of a global conflict that would draw in nations across the world. As World War II began in Europe, America watched from a distance, though tensions were building. The docks in Brooklyn became even more vital, as they were a key link in the movement of goods overseas. The men who controlled the docks held influence not just in the criminal world, but in the city's economy. During the war years, Carlo's influence continued to grow. The U.S. government, aware of the potential for sabotage on the waterfront, quietly sought to ensure that things remained under control. In some cases, this meant working indirectly with men who had real authority on the docks, men like those in the Mangano family. While the details of those arrangements were rarely spoken of openly, they added another layer of complexity to the underworld's operations. Carlo moved through these years like a shadow, always present, rarely noticed. He didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room because he knew that the most important conversations often happened in the quiet corners, away from the crowd. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was with purpose. By the time the war ended in 1945, the world had changed yet again. Soldiers returned home, industries shifted, and the city moved into a new chapter of its history. For the underworld, the post-war years brought a wave of opportunity. Construction was booming, the demand for goods was high, and there was money to be made in every corner of the city. Carlo, now in his early 40s, was perfectly positioned to take advantage of this new era. His influence in the Mangano family was stronger than ever, and his network of contacts reached into businesses both legal and illegal. He had allies in unions, on the docks, and in other families, and just as importantly, he had very few enemies. This was no accident. Carlo understood that personal grudges could be costly. He avoided unnecessary conflicts, preferring negotiation to violence whenever possible. In a world where a careless insult could spiral into a deadly feud, this made him stand out. He didn't let pride push him into decisions that would jeopardize his position. But the calm surface of the Mangano family hid tensions beneath. Vincent Mangano was the boss, but his relationship with his underboss, Albert Anastasia, was strained. Anastasia was a very different kind of man from Carlo, bold, sometimes unpredictable, and feared for his willingness to act decisively and without hesitation. While Mangano valued discretion, Anastasia valued results, even if they drew attention. Carlo watched these tensions quietly. He didn't take sides openly, but he paid close attention. In his world, shifts in leadership could happen suddenly, and being prepared was essential. He had no intention of making reckless moves, but he knew that when the moment came, being aligned with the winning side could change everything. The post-war years were also a time when the structure of organized crime in America was becoming more formalized. The Commission, established in the early 1930s by Charles Lucky Luciano and others, served as a governing body for the Mafia families across the country. It was meant to prevent unnecessary wars, settle disputes, and coordinate business. Carlo understood the value of such organization. Chaos was bad for business, and he was, above all, a businessman in the underworld sense. By the late 1940s, he was no longer just a trusted member of the Mangano family. He was a key player whose counsel was valued by men of higher rank. He had achieved this not by demanding power, but by making himself indispensable. He was the man who could be trusted to handle delicate matters, the man who could smooth over conflicts, the man who could ensure that profits kept flowing without attracting the wrong kind of attention. It was a slow rise, built over decades of patience and careful decision-making, and it was far from over. The years ahead would test Carlo in ways that no amount of quiet observation could fully prepare him for. The world of the New York Mafia was entering a turbulent period, one in which allegiances would shift, old friendships would be tested, and the balance of power could change in an instant. But Carlo Gambino had been preparing for such moments his entire life. From the narrow streets of Caccamo to the bustling docks of Brooklyn, he had learned that true strength lay not in rushing forward recklessly, but in waiting for the perfect moment to act. And when that moment came, to act decisively and without hesitation. Under the cover of Manhattan's constant hum, Carlo Gambino's influence expanded quietly, almost invisibly, like the tide creeping up the shoreline. By the early 1940s, he had perfected the art of blending in while pulling strings in the background. He knew that in the world he inhabited, the ones who boasted too loudly often drew the wrong kind of attention, both from law enforcement and from rivals eager to test their luck. Carlo, however, moved differently. His work was steady, calculated, and always 2 steps ahead of those who might want to challenge him. The streets around Mulberry and Mott bustled with shopkeepers, families and men who kept one eye on their businesses and another on the figures who ran the neighborhood's unspoken order. Carlo wasn't just one of those figures. He was the figure. People might not have known his face, but they knew his influence, and that was exactly how he wanted it. His days were not filled with flashy cars or champagne dinners, but with quiet meetings in dimly lit cafes, the kind of gatherings where deals were made over espresso and folded envelopes changed hands without a word. A nod here, a handshake there. These were the signals that sealed arrangements more binding than any signed contract. Carlo understood the value of patience. He would let an opportunity grow ripe before taking it, knowing that the right timing could make the difference between a profitable venture and a costly misstep. At home, life was as unassuming as it could be. He lived in a modest house in Brooklyn with his wife Catherine and their children, preferring family dinners over crowded banquets. This quiet domestic life was not a mask. It was genuinely how he preferred to live. Yet even at the dinner table, his mind was often at work, replaying the events of the day, considering who might be looking to shift alliances or where the next opening might appear in the network of businesses that dotted the city. The end of World War II brought with it changes that rippled through New York. Returning, soldiers were looking for work, the economy was shifting, and old criminal structures were adapting to a new era. In these transitions, Carlo saw possibility. He began to strengthen his control over certain unions, quietly ensuring that key figures in the labor movement owed him their positions, or at least their loyalty. This control was not just about money, it was about leverage. If you could decide who got work and who didn't, you could influence more than just a paycheck. You could sway loyalty, votes, and the very rhythm of a neighborhood. It was during this period that Carlo's relationship with other prominent figures began to deepen. Men like Albert Anastasia, known for his volatile temper, and Vito Genovese with his own ambitions, were both allies and occasional rivals. Carlo's genius was in knowing how to manage these relationships, offering support when it benefited him, stepping back when tempers flared, and always avoiding unnecessary risks. His calm demeanor often acted as a counterweight to the more explosive personalities around him. One of Carlo's greatest strengths was his memory, not just for faces and names, but for every promise, favor, and debt. He could recall a small gesture someone had done for him years earlier and repay it in a way that secured loyalty for life. Equally, he remembered slights, though he never addressed them in haste. Those who wronged him might not feel the consequences immediately, but the moment would come, often when they least expected it, and always in a way that seemed almost natural. By the early 1950s, the Gambino name was becoming more familiar in certain circles, though Carlo himself remained deliberately in the shadows. The docks, the trucking industry, the garment district, his reach extended into all of them, but there was no brash declaration of ownership. The men who worked those jobs might not even know his name, but their foreman did, and that was enough. It was a system of quiet influence, designed to keep the money flowing and the trouble minimal. Carlo's philosophy was simple: attract as little attention as possible. He was well aware of the FBI's growing interest in organized crime, especially after the Kefauver hearings brought the Mafia into America's living rooms via television. While other men fought for control in public disputes that made headlines, Carlo continued to operate under the radar. Even within his own organization, there was a certain mystery about him. He was approachable, yes, but he revealed very little about himself. To most, he was a man of few words and measured gestures. To those closest to him, he was a strategist of the highest order. One autumn evening, as the leaves turned in Brooklyn, Carlo met with a small group of trusted associates in the back room of a bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifted in from the front as they discussed an opportunity involving a shipping company that had been struggling financially. Carlo didn't rush to take control. He wanted to know who was behind the company, what debts they carried, and what potential risks lay hidden. Only after days of gathering information did he give his quiet approval to move forward, structuring the deal in such a way that the company would appear to remain independent while actually answering to him. The way he saw it, power was best exercised indirectly. The fewer people who knew you were in charge, the safer you were from both law enforcement and betrayal. That philosophy extended to how he managed disputes. Instead of public confrontations, Carlo preferred to resolve issues quietly, often through intermediaries. If two men in his orbit were in conflict, he would find a way for them to reach a compromise, framing it as a mutually beneficial arrangement rather than a victory for one side. As the decade progressed, the underworld's balance of power began to shift. Old bosses were passing away or being taken down by the law, and younger, more aggressive figures were stepping up. The Lucchese and Genovese families were strengthening their positions, while internal tensions brewed within the Gambino family itself. Carlo navigated this changing landscape with the same steady approach he always had, by keeping his allies close, his enemies closer, and his own profile as low as possible. Through all of this, he never lost sight of the long game. To Carlo, every decision was part of a larger picture, a tapestry of influence and relationships that could not be rushed. He didn't need to be the loudest or the most feared. He only needed to be the one still standing when the dust settled. And in the world he inhabited, that was the ultimate measure of success. By the close of the 1950s, Carlo Gambino had positioned himself as one of the most quietly powerful figures in New York's underworld. Few outside his inner circle understood the extent of his influence, but those who did knew that he was not a man to underestimate. In a city where ambition often burned too brightly and too fast, Carlo's steady flame continued to grow, unnoticed by most, but impossible to extinguish. Winter settled heavily over New York, the kind of cold that made the streets feel sharper and the air heavier. For Carlo Gambino, the season brought with it an almost meditative pace. The city slowed down slightly in the bitter months, and that slowness gave him room to think, to plan, to observe without making moves that might stir too much attention. In those early 1960s days, when the wind cut through Brooklyn like a blade, Carlo's influence was beginning to weave deeper into the fabric of the underworld. He was already an important figure, but he still moved like a man with something to protect rather than something to prove. The Gambino family, though carrying his name, was still under the leadership of Albert Anastasia at the time. Anastasia's reputation was notorious, his temper violent, his methods direct. He ruled with intimidation, the kind that could settle disputes before they began simply because people feared what might follow if they crossed him. Carlo, however, was the opposite. He preferred discretion over spectacle, diplomacy over open threats. The two men were different in temperament, but for a time their goals aligned enough that they worked without serious conflict. Carlo played the role of a trusted underboss, careful not to challenge Anastasia's ego, yet always thinking about the future. Carlo's house in Brooklyn remained modest, almost deliberately so. Neighbors saw him as a quiet, polite family man, who often left in the morning dressed neatly, but without the flashy signs of wealth some in his world flaunted. His daily schedule was unpredictable to anyone watching casually. Some days he could be seen stepping into a small social club where the regulars played cards and sipped espresso. Other days, he would be in the back of a bakery or walking the docks with a foreman who owed him more than just friendship. Behind the scenes, Carlo was steadily cultivating relationships that would outlast Anastasia's volatile reign. The union leaders who controlled the flow of goods through New York's ports trusted him because he didn't push too far, too fast. Shop owners respected him because he listened before speaking and seemed to understand the rhythms of their work. Even among the city's other bosses, there was an awareness that Carlo's advice, when offered, was rarely without merit. Then came a shift, the kind that would set the course for the rest of his life. The late 1950s had been turbulent in the underworld, with high-profile hits and growing pressure from law enforcement. Anastasia's unpredictable violence had earned him enemies both inside and outside his family. Carlo watched this without interfering, knowing that in such situations, patience was more powerful than force. Eventually, that patience paid off. In 1957, Albert Anastasia was murdered in a Manhattan barbershop, a killing that shocked the city but seemed almost inevitable to those within the life. The days following the assassination were tense. Leadership changes in their world were never smooth, and the wrong move could lead to bloodshed. But Carlo, with his steady hand and long-built alliances, moved into the vacuum left behind. He didn't claim the top spot with bluster or public displays. He simply stepped into the role as though it had been waiting for him all along. The other capos respected him, partly because he didn't try to grab everything for himself at once, and partly because they knew he could be trusted to maintain stability. With Carlo at the helm, the family's operations began to shift subtly. He streamlined certain rackets, tightened the family's grip on profitable industries, and reduced exposure to unnecessary risks. Gambling operations were handled quietly, labor racketeering became more organized, and the family's connections in construction deepened. Carlo was a master at making money in ways that looked on the surface like legitimate business. This not only increased profits, but also gave law enforcement fewer clear openings to attack him. Even so, he was not naive about the risks. Surveillance was growing, wiretaps were becoming more common, and informants were a constant concern. To counter this, Carlo limited who had direct access to him. His meetings were small, often involving no more than 2 or 3 trusted men. Conversations were brief, coded, and usually conducted in places where background noise or movement would make listening devices useless. But it wasn't just the law he had to think about. It was also the other families. The 5 families of New York operated under a delicate balance, one maintained by the Commission, an arrangement designed to avoid unnecessary wars. Carlo, now one of the most respected voices at the table, used that position to strengthen his own influence without openly threatening anyone else's territory. He often acted as a mediator when disputes arose, gaining trust from both sides and ensuring that the Gambino family's interests were quietly advanced. His leadership style was not about fear. It was about predictability. Men in his orbit knew where they stood with him, and that kind of stability was rare in their world. If Carlo gave his word, he kept it. If someone broke their word to him, there would be consequences, but never in a way that caused unnecessary noise. Problems were resolved quietly, often so quietly that outsiders didn't even realize there had been a problem in the first place. By the mid-1960s, the Gambino family had grown into the most powerful of the 5 families, though many outside their circles still didn't fully grasp the scale of Carlo's reach. His influence extended beyond New York into New Jersey, Florida, and even overseas, yet he remained the picture of understatement. The same small house, the same quiet routines, the same careful manner of speaking. If you passed him on the street, you might mistake him for a neighborhood shop owner or a retired dock worker. That invisibility was his armor. There were moments, of course, when his authority had to be made clear. One such moment came when a younger capo, flush with recent earnings, began making moves without permission, overstepping into areas controlled by other families. Word of the overreach reached Carlo quickly. Rather than confront the man directly, he invited him to a quiet dinner. They spoke about business, about loyalty, about the dangers of ambition unchecked. The younger man left the table humbled. His expansion halted without a single threat spoken aloud. The message was clear. Carlo didn't need to shout to be heard. Outside of the life, the world was changing rapidly. The civil rights movement, political unrest, and economic shifts were transforming the country. Carlo adapted by diversifying the family's operations. Construction projects tied to urban development became a major source of income, and labor influence allowed him to guide contracts toward companies friendly to his interests. It was a slow, deliberate expansion, the kind that couldn't be easily undone. Through it all, his greatest skill remained the same, seeing further ahead than those around him. He never got lost in the moment, never let emotion dictate his choices. For Carlo Gambino, every move was part of a game that spanned decades. The players might change, the rules might shift, but his objective stayed the same: to maintain control without becoming a target. And as the years went by, that quiet, steady approach would prove to be his greatest strength. The mid-1960s brought with them a sense of quiet dominance for Carlo Gambino. While the city pulsed with the energy of change, protests filling streets, music blaring from shop radios, skyscrapers reaching ever higher, Carlo's world operated in the shadows, just beneath the surface of ordinary life. By now, his name was spoken in hushed tones in certain corners of New York, not out of fear alone, but from respect. He had achieved what so many in his position only dreamed of, near complete control without needing to constantly show it. His family's influence over the garment district was one of the clearest signs of his reach. The clothing industry was a giant in New York, with shipments moving in and out daily. The trucking companies that carried those goods didn't make moves without considering who they were dealing with. The unions, the warehouses, the manufacturers, many of them had ties, whether they liked it or not, to the Gambino organization. But Carlo ran it differently from his predecessors. He didn't bleed the businesses dry. He took his share, but he made sure the operations remained healthy, ensuring the money kept flowing for years instead of months. This approach created loyalty, or at least a careful acceptance from those involved. Carlo understood better than most that his success depended on stability. He was not a gambler in the sense that many others in his world were. Quick, risky ventures that promised fast money held no appeal to him. He favored slow, steady streams of income. A steady river could run for decades if you didn't pollute it with recklessness. He had his hands in construction, shipping, the docks, the unions, and a discreet network of gambling operations. Each was carefully managed, each with layers of buffers between him and the actual street-level dealings. The police and the FBI knew his name, of course. He had been watched for years, followed by agents who took photos of him coming and going from clubs and restaurants. They would see him walk into a meeting, sit for an hour over espresso, speak in low tones, and leave without fanfare. They had files full of photographs, but almost nothing concrete to tie him to illegal activity. Carlo thrived in that space, the gap between suspicion and proof. He knew that being seen was not always a liability. It was being caught that mattered, and he had no intention of ever being caught. In public, he was the embodiment of restraint. At social events, he was polite but not overly talkative. In private gatherings, he listened far more than he spoke, letting others reveal themselves while he measured their words. Men left meetings with him feeling as if they'd been guided rather than ordered, yet they followed his lead without question. It was a rare skill, one that made him not only powerful but irreplaceable. One of his greatest tools was his network of informants and allies outside the family. Dock workers, waiters, union clerks, small-time hustlers, people who were not formally part of the organization but who owed him favors or simply liked the quiet way he operated. They fed him information, sometimes without even realizing its value. A casual remark about a shipment, a mention of a city inspector changing his route, an overheard complaint about another boss. Carlo pieced these bits together like a puzzle, giving him a clearer view of the city's undercurrents than most law enforcement agencies could manage. It was during this period that his influence began to extend even further south. Florida was becoming a playground for the wealthy, with its beaches, hotels, and growing tourist trade. But for men like Carlo, it was also a place of opportunity. The state's expanding development projects and relaxed atmosphere made it an ideal extension of certain business ventures. Through trusted associates, Carlo established footholds in Miami and other cities. These were not wild ventures but calculated steps, each one taken after careful study. His trips to Florida were never hurried. He would travel under the guise of visiting friends or attending social events. Meetings would take place quietly in back rooms or during long walks along hotel gardens. The locals who worked with him appreciated his methodical nature. Unlike others who swept in demanding quick returns, Carlo built his presence slowly, ensuring that by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late to push him out. Back in New York, the balance of power among the five families was always delicate. Disputes arose, territory overlaps, disagreements over union control, disputes over loan-sharking territories. Carlo often acted as a voice of reason during these tensions. He had a way of speaking that diffused anger without appearing weak, offering compromises that left both sides feeling they had won something. This role as a mediator increased his standing within the commission, making him one of the most trusted figures at the table. But he was not without challenges. The younger generation coming up in the ranks was often impatient. They saw the wealth and influence of men like Carlo and wanted it immediately. Some dismissed his caution as outdated. To them, the changing times demanded bolder moves. Carlo handled these men with care. He would give them small tests, control over a modest operation, management of a limited territory. If they proved themselves disciplined, they might rise further. If they overreached or brought unwanted attention, they were quietly moved aside before they could do real damage. This approach was not without its critics. Some capos felt he was too slow to expand, too unwilling to take advantage of opportunities when they arose. But Carlo knew that in their world, the fastest moves often led to the shortest careers. He believed that the true measure of success was not how quickly you could rise, but how long you could stay at the top. It was around this time that law enforcement intensified their efforts against organized crime. The FBI, under its new Organized Crime Initiative, began using electronic surveillance more aggressively. Carlo adapted. Meetings were held in noisy locations, construction sites, busy cafes, even walking in parks where the rustling leaves or city noise made recording difficult. Messages were passed indirectly, often through multiple intermediaries, so that no single person could betray the full picture. Still, he knew the pressure would only grow. His answer to this was the same as it had always been: patience, precision, and the cultivation of loyalty. Those who worked with him understood that as long as they followed his rules, they would be protected. Those who didn't simply drifted out of his orbit. By the end of the decade, Carlo Gambino stood as one of the most powerful men in New York, yet to the casual observer, he was almost invisible. He was a shadow moving through the city, a man who could be at the center of everything while seeming to be on the edge of it. It was exactly where he wanted to be. The early 1970s in New York felt like a city caught between eras. Skyscrapers rose higher than ever, new fashions filled the streets, and music blasted from every corner. But underneath the surface, the city was straining. Crime rates climbed, corruption scandals made headlines, and the law was beginning to evolve in ways that posed a real threat to men like Carlo Gambino. For decades, organized crime had been able to thrive in the gray areas of the law, protected by silence, influence, and a public that often preferred not to see too much. Now, federal agencies were learning to dig deeper, to wiretap, to follow the money instead of the man. Carlo knew this long before most of his peers did. He had spent years observing not just his rivals, but the government itself, tracking changes in its methods like a chess player studying an opponent's opening moves. What he saw in the early years of the decade concerned him. The FBI's new organized crime strike forces were better funded, more patient, and, most dangerously, more willing to work with informants. Loyalty had always been the foundation of Carlo's world. If that foundation started to crack, the whole structure could collapse. He began making changes quietly. Some meetings that used to happen in familiar restaurants or social clubs were moved entirely to private homes. Not his own, of course. Carlo was far too careful for that. But the homes of trusted associates who had no reason to be on law enforcement's radar. Conversations became shorter, more to the point. Messages that once traveled by word of mouth through 2 or 3 intermediaries now passed through 5 or 6, each one carefully chosen to know only a fraction of the truth. This was also the period when he started to sense subtle shifts in the balance of power among the 5 families. The younger bosses, men who had grown up in the shadow of giants like Albert Anastasia and Vito Genovese, were more aggressive, more eager to leave their mark. They wanted territory, and they didn't always care whether they took it through negotiation or confrontation. Carlo could feel their eyes on his holdings, especially the garment district and the trucking routes. These operations were steady moneymakers, and steady moneymakers were always tempting targets. One of the trickiest situations came from the construction boom sweeping through the city. With new high-rises and public projects in motion, The unions were more valuable than ever. The Gambino family had deep roots in these unions, and that meant control over jobs, contracts, and, most importantly, money. Rival families wanted a piece, and disputes began simmering under the surface. Carlo, with his preference for diplomacy, started arranging quiet sit-downs to divide the opportunities before the tension could boil over. The men he dealt with often underestimated him because of his soft-spoken nature. In a world where tempers flared and voices were raised, Carlo rarely raised his own. But there was steel behind his calm. When he drew a line, it was understood that crossing it would bring consequences, though those consequences rarely played out in public. He believed in letting others see the benefits of cooperation over the cost of conflict. More often than not, that was enough. Outside of New York, his foothold in Florida continued to grow. The state's development boom meant construction, tourism, and a steady influx of both investors and opportunists. Through allies who had been with him for years, Carlo made sure his operations there were discreet but profitable. He didn't flood the area with men from New York. That would have drawn attention. Instead, he worked through locals who could blend in, handling day-to-day matters while sending a quiet stream of profits back north. But even with his skill at keeping things calm, there were problems he could not entirely control. Law enforcement pressure was building in ways that no amount of diplomacy could dissolve. Wiretaps, hidden microphones, and undercover agents were not the tools of the old days. They were harder to spot, harder to defend against. Carlo's men began hearing rumors of friends who had been questioned, sometimes more than once, by federal agents. A few associates who had been reliable for years suddenly seemed nervous, jumpy. Carlo understood. That fear could be as dangerous as betrayal. A frightened man might make careless mistakes, talk too freely, or worst of all, start looking for a way out that involved cutting a deal with the authorities. He watched for these signs closely, moving some men into less sensitive roles and quietly letting others drift away entirely. It was never done with open confrontation. He preferred to make the changes look natural, as if they had been the other man's idea. One of the more delicate situations came when a small-time associate in the garment district was caught in a sting by the police. It was a minor case, nothing that could touch Carlo directly, but the man began talking too much to his arresting officers. Not enough to cause damage yet, but enough to raise alarms. Carlo didn't respond with threats. Instead, he arranged for the man to be quietly helped. His legal troubles eased just enough to remind him where his real support came from. Gratitude, Carlo knew, was a far more reliable bond than fear. Through all of this, his personal life remained as guarded as his business dealings. He was a family man in the truest sense, spending quiet evenings at home when he could, avoiding the limelight. While others in his position enjoyed flashy displays of wealth, Carlo's tastes were modest. This was partly his nature and partly his strategy. Flash attracted attention, and attention was dangerous. The fewer headlines he made, the longer he could continue his work undisturbed. By the mid-1970s, the city around him had changed again. The economy was struggling, unemployment was up, and crime in the streets was becoming more brazen. Yet Carlo's world kept its steady rhythm. His family remained strong, his alliances intact, and his enemies careful not to push too hard. The FBI still watched, but they had no direct evidence to bring him down. To them, he was the ultimate frustration, a man they knew was at the center of it all, but who never left fingerprints on anything. That was exactly how Carlo liked it. He wasn't interested in fame or notoriety. His measure of success was simple: control without exposure, influence without noise, and in those years, he had both. But the changes in law enforcement were not slowing, and even Carlo knew that his style of leadership would soon face tests unlike anything he had encountered before. By the late 1970s, the steady rhythm Carlo Gambino had maintained for decades began to feel just a little less steady. It wasn't a collapse, not even close. His grip on power was still firm, his influence still far-reaching, but there was a subtle shift in the air. He could sense it in conversations that seemed a touch too cautious. in meetings where younger men sat forward in their chairs with a certain restlessness, in the way law enforcement's gaze felt sharper, more deliberate. The world was moving faster, and it was beginning to close in from multiple directions. One of the first real challenges came from within the network of the five families themselves. For years, Carlo had relied on his ability to maintain balance among the other bosses, stepping in to smooth disputes before they could escalate. He had done it so often and so effectively that many took it for granted, assuming that peace was simply the natural order of things. But some of the younger, more ambitious figures saw peace as stagnation. They wanted expansion, more money, more influence, and they were less patient about how to get it. In the construction rackets, competition began to intensify. A large public project in Manhattan, a massive redevelopment that promised years of steady work, was suddenly at the center of a quiet but fierce battle. Rival families wanted a larger slice of the contracts, and some factions within Carlo's own family argued for pushing back harder to keep them out. Carlo, as always, preferred negotiation. He arranged a meeting at a neutral location, far from prying eyes, where representatives could sit down and divide the work without bloodshed. The talks were tense, but his calm authority carried the day. Still, the fact that the dispute had gotten as heated as it did was a sign. Restraint was no longer as widely valued as it once had been. At the same time, law enforcement's pressure was reaching new levels. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, was beginning to prove its worth to prosecutors. It was a dangerous tool because it didn't require direct evidence of a single crime. Instead, it allowed the government to connect smaller, seemingly unrelated acts into a pattern of organized activity. For a man like Carlo, whose hands were rarely, if ever, on the actual operations, this was a troubling development. The old rules, that you were safe as long as you stayed away from the day-to-day business, no longer applied. Wiretaps became a constant concern. Carlo instructed his men to keep conversations short, vague, and often coded beyond recognition. He preferred face-to-face meetings in places where electronics could be controlled or kept out entirely. Some younger associates thought these measures were excessive, but he knew better. The days when the government had to rely on eyewitness testimony were fading. Now, a microphone hidden in the right place could do more damage than any informant. In the middle of all this, Carlo's own health began to trouble him. He had always been careful, maintaining a quiet lifestyle that kept him out of unnecessary danger. But age was something no one could avoid. Friends noticed that he seemed a little slower on his feet, that he sometimes paused longer than usual before speaking. He brushed off their concerns, but in private he was aware that his body didn't respond as quickly as it used to. He had no intention of stepping down, but the thought began to creep in. What would happen when he could no longer lead? Choosing a successor was no simple matter. In theory, the obvious choice would be someone with deep loyalty to him, someone who understood his way of doing things, calm, strategic, always thinking 3 moves ahead. But loyalty could be tricky, especially when ambition was involved. There were men in his family who had the brains for leadership, but not the patience. Others had the patience, but not the respect of the younger generation. The wrong choice could undo years of stability in a matter of months. He began quietly testing his inner circle, giving certain men small but significant responsibilities to see how they handled them. One might be sent to resolve a dispute in Brooklyn without using force. Another might be asked to oversee a new business venture and ensure it stayed off law enforcement's radar. Carlo paid close attention to how they managed these tasks, not just the results, but the way they achieved them. He wanted to see who could think like he did, who could see the bigger picture without getting lost in the details. Meanwhile, the FBI was circling closer to some of his long-standing allies. A federal case in New Jersey threatened to pull in a handful of men connected to the trucking industry, and though Carlo himself was not named, he knew how quickly that could change. He tightened his circle further, limiting contact with anyone who was under investigation. For some, it felt like a cold move, but Carlo understood it as survival. If a man was already on the government's radar, Bringing him too close risked bringing that attention straight to the top. Despite the growing pressures, Carlo never let the public see him rattled. In the streets, he remained the same reserved figure, moving quietly, speaking softly, never making a scene. This composure was one of his greatest weapons. If he appeared unshaken, others took it as a sign that everything was under control. In truth, he was working harder than ever behind the scenes to keep it that way. There were also moments when the old ways still worked to his advantage. In one case, a potential conflict over gambling routes was settled not with threats or lawyers, but over a private dinner in the back room of a restaurant. Two men who had been ready to undercut each other's operations walked away with a mutual agreement, thanks to Carlo's quiet persuasion. He reminded them that steady profit was better than risky expansion, that a business only worked if everyone could operate without constant fights. They left not just with a deal, but with a renewed respect for the man who had kept the peace for so long. Still, the landscape was changing, and he knew it. The government's cases were becoming more sophisticated, rival bosses were growing bolder, and even some of his oldest associates were starting to feel the pull of retirement or the temptation of stepping into the spotlight themselves. Carlo's challenge was no longer just to protect his own position, it was to prepare his organization for a future he might not be part of. Late at night, when the city outside was quiet and his own house was still, he would sometimes sit in his study, going over the past. He thought about the moves that had brought him here, the risks he had taken, the risks he had avoided. He thought about the friends who had stood beside him for decades, and those who had fallen along the way. And he thought about the day that would eventually come when he would have to let go, whether he was ready or not. For now, he was still in control. The streets still listened when he spoke. The other families still treated his word as law, and his own men still moved with confidence under his direction. But the horizon was shifting, and Carlo Gambino, who had built his career on reading the currents before others could see them, was already preparing for what was to come. By the dawn of the 1980s, Carlo Gambino had become a living paradox. He was a man whose name inspired both fear and respect, yet whose personal life was defined by restraint and quiet order. But beneath that calm surface, the pressures that had been building for years were beginning to press harder. His health, once an afterthought in his disciplined routine, had started to demand more attention. The occasional stiffness in his joints was now joined by shortness of breath after even mild exertion. Some days he felt sharp and in command. Other days his body reminded him in subtle but insistent ways that time was no longer his ally. The Gambino family itself was still steady on the surface, but Carlo knew that an organization of its size could only remain stable if the leadership at the top was undisputed. The idea of succession, something he had always kept in the back of his mind, was now a daily consideration. He could no longer afford to think of it as a distant issue. Whoever took the reins after him would inherit not just a powerful family, but a volatile balance among the 5 families, each with its own ambitions and rivalries. One wrong move could ignite conflicts that would undo decades of carefully maintained peace. Choosing that successor was an exercise in patience and subtlety. There were men he trusted, but trust alone wasn't enough. He needed someone who could navigate the political terrain with the same precision he had, someone who could sit across from a rival boss and walk away with an agreement instead of a war. He also needed someone who would command loyalty from the street-level soldiers, the people who actually made the family's wealth flow. That meant balancing intelligence, respect, and a certain quiet authority that couldn't be faked. Paul Castellano, Carlo's cousin by marriage, was one of the most obvious candidates. Castellano had a businessman's mind, preferring white-collar rackets and legitimate-looking ventures over the more dangerous street-level operations. He had a knack for avoiding unnecessary exposure, and he shared Carlo's belief in keeping violence to a minimum. But Paul lacked the universal respect that a street-hardened leader like Carlo commanded. Many of the old-school soldiers thought of him as too insulated, too detached from the rougher realities of their world. On the other side was Agnello Della Croce, the underboss. Della Croce had come up through the streets, earning his reputation the hard way. He was respected, feared even, by the rank and file, and his loyalty to Carlo was unquestionable. But his style was different. Where Carlo avoided unnecessary risks, Della Croce was more willing to embrace them. He could be diplomatic when needed, but his instinct leaned toward a tougher, more confrontational approach. Carlo admired him, but he also knew that putting a man like Della Croce at the helm could potentially invite more heat from law enforcement. The delicate decision weighed on him. He knew that no matter who he chose, someone would feel slighted, and in their world, resentment could turn into something far more dangerous. He also knew that his own influence might not be enough to enforce that choice once he was gone. It wasn't just about naming a successor. It was about setting up a structure that could prevent the fallout from tearing the family apart. Meanwhile, the FBI had shifted from circling to pressing in. The new generation of agents was more aggressive, more relentless. They had embraced technology in a way the older generation never had. Hidden microphones in meeting places, cameras where no one expected them, even undercover operations that planted agents inside seemingly legitimate businesses connected to the family. Carlo had spent years keeping himself insulated from direct criminal acts, but with RICO laws in place, even his distance could be bridged by a patient and thorough investigation. The Bureau's strategy was no longer to take down one man at a time. They were going after the infrastructure, cutting into the financial channels, turning mid-level operators into informants and building cases piece by piece. Carlo recognized the pattern. It was like watching someone slowly tighten a net. There was no sudden strike, just a steady, unrelenting constriction until escape became impossible. It was around this time that a federal prosecutor in Manhattan began to hint at a major case involving several high-ranking figures in the Italian-American underworld. Carlo wasn't named publicly, but privately he understood the implication. If they could connect him to even a fraction of the family's activities, the charges could be devastating. He responded the way he always had, by tightening the circle, reducing exposure, and removing any unnecessary links between himself and the operations. But even as he made these adjustments, there was another kind of pressure building, one from within the underworld itself. Younger men, impatient with the slow pace of change, wanted a more aggressive approach to expanding territory and influence. They saw the drug trade, which Carlo had long prohibited within the family, as a fast and lucrative source of income. Carlo had always opposed it, believing it brought too much law enforcement attention and too many unnecessary risks. But the temptation was strong, and whispers about defying the rule began to circulate. Carlo confronted the issue directly, calling in a handful of key figures and making it clear that his position had not changed. He spoke with the same calm authority he always had, but this time, there was an undercurrent of steel in his tone. The drug trade, he reminded them, was not just dangerous. It was a violation of the code he had built the family's stability on. If they wanted fast money, they would have to find another way. The room was silent when he finished, but he could tell the debate wasn't over. It was simply going underground. In his private moments, Carlo began to take stock of his life in a way he never had before. He thought about the years he had spent building this empire, about the quiet moves and calculated risks that had kept him out of prison while so many others had fallen. He thought about the alliances he had formed, the disputes he had settled before they could turn into wars. And he thought about the end, because whether it came suddenly or slowly, it was inevitable. His health was now a daily reminder of that inevitability. Some mornings he found himself short of breath just walking from one room to another. Doctors had hinted that his heart was weakening, but Carlo rarely discussed it. In their world, weakness was something you never admitted. Still, he began to make small adjustments, delegating more, resting when he could, choosing his appearances carefully. By late in the year, he knew that the time to finalize his succession plan had come. He decided on Castellano, believing that his business-first approach would attract less heat and preserve the family's long-term stability. But he also took care to maintain Della Croce's position and authority, hoping to keep the street soldiers loyal by ensuring their champion remained in a position of influence. It was a delicate balance, and Carlo knew it might not hold forever. But it was the best he could do. In the weeks that followed, he worked quietly to reinforce this structure. He met privately with allies in the other families, explaining his intentions and seeking their understanding. He spoke with key lieutenants, framing the decision not as a shift in power, but as a continuation of the same steady leadership they had always known. Some accepted it without question. Others hid their doubts behind polite agreement. As the year drew toward its close, Carlo's appearances became rarer, his movements slower. Yet his mind remained sharp, and his influence still shaped the city's underworld in ways few could see. In the streets, the Gambino name still carried the same weight it always had. Inside the quiet walls of his home, he could feel the years pressing down, the weight of everything he had built, and the knowledge that soon it would no longer be his to guide. He had always lived by a simple truth. Power was not about noise. It was about control. And control, in the end, was about knowing when to act and when to step back. Now, as the shadows lengthened and his time drew shorter, Carlo Gambino was preparing to do what he had done his entire life. Make the move that would keep the balance intact for as long as possible, even if he wouldn't be there to see it. Under Carlo Gambino's steady hand, the family continued to grow in power and influence, and the 1960s proved to be a decade of quiet, calculated expansion. While other mob bosses were making headlines for dramatic hits or public trials, Carlo kept himself removed from such attention. He preferred the soft power of influence over the hard edge of intimidation in public view. His strategy was simple: keep the business profitable, keep the peace within the organization, and avoid unnecessary conflicts that could attract the wrong kind of attention. He knew that the true strength of a leader wasn't shown in how loudly he could speak, but in how deeply his words carried when they were spoken. The city was changing. New York was expanding upward and outward, construction cranes marking the skyline, while shipping and dock work still held enormous economic sway. Carlo recognized that the real power wasn't in the streets where soldiers patrolled, but in the contracts that determined who got to work and who didn't. The docks were still lucrative, and controlling union leadership there meant controlling millions of dollars. Gambino used his network to ensure that loyal allies held key union positions, giving him influence over which companies could operate and on what terms. This wasn't done with grand announcements. It was arranged in private meetings, whispered agreements, and the kind of handshakes that sealed unspoken promises. Carlo had a gift for understanding people's motivations. He could meet a man once and tell exactly how to handle him, whether he needed a favor, a warning, or a business opportunity. This intuitive grasp of human nature allowed him to resolve disputes before they became crises. If a soldier had a grievance with a captain, Carlo would call them in, listen patiently, and propose a solution that left both men feeling they'd been treated fairly. He was never quick to anger in these meetings. Instead, he gave the impression of a calm judge whose decisions were final, but whose fairness was beyond question. The loyalty this earned him was unmatched. In a world where fear was often the glue that held crews together, Carlo built bonds based on mutual benefit and respect. Men wanted to work for him, not just because they feared what might happen if they didn't, but because they genuinely trusted his judgment. He paid attention to the small things, remembering birthdays, checking in on families, helping a struggling relative get a job, gestures that meant a great deal in a life where betrayal could come from anywhere. But this didn't mean he was soft. Beneath the calm exterior, Carlo had clear lines that no one could cross without consequences. When loyalty was broken, or greed threatened the balance of the family, Carlo acted decisively. However, even in these moments, he ensured that the actions taken were quiet, discreet, and removed from public eye. His philosophy was simple: let the problem disappear, but leave no ripples behind. By the mid-1960s, the Gambino family had become the most powerful of the five families, and Carlo's influence extended beyond New York. His relationships with other bosses across the country were carefully cultivated, built on years of mutual favors and trust. When disputes arose between families in other cities, Carlo was sometimes called upon to mediate, his reputation as a fair and level-headed leader making him the natural choice. This role further elevated his standing in the national underworld, solidifying his position not just as a boss, but as a statesman of the Mafia. One of Carlo's most notable strengths was his ability to adapt to the times. While some old-school bosses resisted changes in how business was done, Carlo embraced new opportunities as they arose, always with caution. He understood that expanding too quickly or without proper safeguards could lead to exposure. Whether it was in construction contracts, trucking routes, or even emerging financial schemes, Carlo ensured that every move was calculated, every risk weighed, and every potential ally vetted. Even law enforcement began to take note of his unique approach. While they knew he was at the helm of the Gambino family, they had remarkably little to pin on him directly. He rarely left a paper trail, never spoke openly about business over the phone, and almost never appeared in the same place as known criminal acts. His meetings were held in private homes or quiet restaurants, often under the guise of friendly dinners rather than official business gatherings. This made it incredibly difficult for investigators to gather evidence against him. Carlo's family life also reinforced his public image as a disciplined, respectable man. He was deeply private, keeping his wife and children away from the limelight and never mixing them into the world he operated in. In photographs, he appeared calm, well-dressed, and dignified, more like a successful businessman than a feared mob boss. This contrast between perception and reality was one of his greatest shields. Neighbors might see him as a quiet man who took care of his home and family, completely unaware of the vast empire he controlled. Within the family, Carlo maintained an old-world sense of hierarchy and discipline. He expected his captains to manage their crews effectively and report directly to him when necessary, but he rarely micromanaged. Instead, he trusted the men he promoted, holding them accountable for results. If someone failed repeatedly, he was replaced, not with fanfare or humiliation, but with a simple, quiet shift that ensured the machine kept running smoothly. One story often told by those who knew him was about a captain who had been careless in handling a lucrative contract, drawing unwanted attention from the press. Rather than berating the man publicly, Carlo invited him for dinner. Over the course of a calm meal, he explained the risks of such carelessness, outlined the changes that needed to be made, and assigned a trusted lieutenant to oversee the captain's work until the problem was resolved. The captain left the table humbled but loyal, grateful for the chance to correct his mistakes rather than being cast out or worse. Carlo's restraint and patience became his signature, but so did his long memory. Those who crossed him or the family rarely found forgiveness, even if the consequences took years to arrive. He believed in timing, that a lesson delivered at the right moment could be far more effective than immediate retaliation. This mindset allowed him to outmaneuver rivals who acted impulsively, letting them make mistakes that weakened their own positions before Carlo stepped in to resolve matters permanently. As the decade drew to a close, Carlo had positioned the Gambino family at the height of its power, without sparking the kind of violent headlines that plagued other families. His quiet approach didn't just keep him out of prison, it made him nearly untouchable in a world where attention was often a man's undoing. Yet for all his success, Carlo understood that power was never permanent. The same discipline that had carried him this far would be needed to protect what he had built, because in the underworld, there was always someone waiting for an opportunity to rise. And Carlo Gambino had no intention of giving them that chance. By the early 1970s, Carlo Gambino's world had evolved into a carefully balanced empire, one in which every piece fit into place as if it had been arranged decades in advance. The quiet streets of certain Brooklyn neighborhoods were under his invisible protection, and businesses operated with a smooth efficiency that seemed natural to outsiders but was, in reality, the product of years of deliberate organization. Carlo had woven himself into the fabric of the city without shouting his presence. He was everywhere, and nowhere at once, a man whose influence was felt in places where his name was never spoken aloud. At this point in his life, Carlo had seen enough to know that real threats didn't always come from enemies. Sometimes they came from within, disguised as ambition or disguised as loyalty. He paid close attention to subtle changes in people: a soldier who suddenly dressed better, a captain who asked fewer questions, a partner who delayed in delivering his share. These were small signals, but to Carlo they were warning signs. He would quietly investigate, using his vast network of informants, and by the time he addressed the problem, he already knew the truth. It was a habit born from decades in a business where trust was precious and betrayal was deadly. The country was changing. Law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated, using new surveillance technology, wiretaps, and long-term undercover work. The government was also beginning to treat organized crime as a national priority rather than a local nuisance. Carlo adapted immediately. He insisted his people keep their meetings short, use coded language, and never handle sensitive discussions in places where strangers might be listening. He even reduced the number of people who could reach him directly, limiting his circle to a handful of trusted lieutenants who had proven themselves over many years. But it wasn't just the police and federal agents who posed a challenge. Other families in New York were shifting in leadership, and not all of them shared Carlo's patient, low-profile approach. Some bosses still believed in flashy power moves, high-profile hits, public displays of wealth, reckless expansion into new rackets. Carlo saw these moves for what they were: risks that brought attention, and attention was the first step toward downfall. His focus remained on the businesses that could be controlled from the shadows. Construction was booming, and with it came opportunities in cement contracts, trucking, and labor unions. The family's reach extended deep into these industries, ensuring that no major building project in the city moved forward without their knowledge, and often without their silent approval. In many cases, legitimate businessmen preferred it that way. Dealing with Carlo's people meant fewer delays, smoother negotiations, and a guarantee of protection from troublemakers, both in and out of the law. Carlo's greatest strength remained his ability to think beyond the immediate score. Where others saw only the profit of the week, Carlo saw the stability of the decade. He was willing to pass on a deal if it risked exposing the family to too much attention, believing that patience would always bring a better opportunity. This patience had been tested many times by hot-headed underlings, by greedy associates, and by the changing tides of the city itself. But Carlo never wavered. One evening in the early 1970s, he attended a small gathering at the home of a trusted ally. These dinners were not business meetings in the formal sense, but rather opportunities to gauge the mood of his people. Over a simple meal, Carlo listened more than he spoke, allowing others to talk freely. It was in these moments that he gathered the most valuable information, not from direct admissions, but from the tone in a man's voice, the hesitation before he answered, or the way his eyes shifted when certain topics came up. That night, he left the table knowing exactly which captain was growing restless and which soldier was quietly becoming indispensable. His health, though, had begun to show signs of strain. Years of quiet control had kept him away from violent street confrontations, but the constant mental pressure took its toll. Still, Carlo refused to let anyone see weakness. He maintained his routines: morning walks, careful meetings, unhurried conversations, all while keeping a close eye on succession. He knew that a leader's greatest failure could be leaving his empire unprepared for the next chapter. Carlo began grooming certain men for greater responsibilities, though he never announced it. His method was to give them increasingly complex tasks, each one a test of loyalty, discretion, and intelligence. Those who passed earned more trust. Those who failed often didn't realize they had been quietly removed from the line of succession. In this period, a new challenge emerged from outside the traditional underworld: a growing push by federal authorities to use laws like the RICO Act to dismantle organized crime from the top down. While other bosses dismissed the threat, Carlo took it seriously. He understood that the real danger wasn't just being caught committing a crime, but being connected to one through the testimony of others. He tightened the family's operations even further, reducing communication chains and ensuring that no one person had enough information to bring the whole structure down. One of his most remarkable talents was making people believe that his absence from a situation was a sign of disinterest, when in reality, it was the opposite. Carlo would allow rival factions to think they were acting independently, only to step in at the precise moment when he could influence the outcome without revealing how much he had been guiding it from the start. Through all of this, his reputation in the underworld remained unmatched. Even men who didn't like him respected him. He was the kind of boss who could walk into a room and, without raising his voice, command absolute attention. There was no need for threats. His presence alone carried the weight of decades of unshakable authority. By the middle of the decade, Carlo had reached a point where he no longer needed to chase power. Power came to him. Politicians, businessmen, union leaders, and fellow bosses all sought his counsel, each aware that a word from him could change the direction of their fortunes. This influence was a delicate thing to maintain, and Carlo treated it with the same care as a rare and valuable treasure. He also understood the importance of legacy. The streets forget quickly, but a man's influence can live on if the right structures are in place. Carlo worked quietly to ensure that the family would continue to operate smoothly, even if something happened to him. This meant not only appointing the right people, but also making sure they understood his philosophy. Avoid the spotlight, stay patient, and never mistake noise for strength. Despite his age and health concerns, Carlo still managed to surprise those around him with his alertness and sharp mind. In private moments, he reflected on the decades he had spent navigating a world where one wrong move could end everything. There had been close calls, times when rivals plotted against him, times when law enforcement seemed to close in, but through it all, he had remained a step ahead. Carlo Gambino had built more than just a criminal empire. He had built a way of operating, a culture of discipline and subtlety that stood in stark contrast to the chaos that often consumed others in his world. And as he entered the twilight of his life, he did so knowing that few had ever matched his combination of patience, cunning, and quiet power. The world around him was shifting rapidly, and challenges still lay ahead. But for the moment, Carlo remained exactly where he had always been. In control, unseen yet everywhere, a shadow on the city that no one could quite catch. The late 1970s brought a strange mixture of stability and tension for Carlo Gambino. On the surface, his empire seemed untouchable. His decisions still shaped the flow of money and influence across the city. The union deals, the construction contracts, the careful distribution of gambling operations, they all still moved in quiet rhythm under his direction. But Carlo could feel the undercurrents shifting. He was too experienced not to notice the subtle cracks that appeared when time began to press on a man's reign. He had outlasted so many rivals that he sometimes wondered if longevity itself had become both his greatest strength and his most delicate vulnerability. The old friends, the allies who had risen beside him, were fewer now. Some had died naturally, some had met violent ends, and others had been taken down by the law. The next generation, the men in their 30s and 40s, who now handled the street-level operations, had not lived through the same wars and negotiations that had shaped him. They were ambitious, sometimes impatient, and while they respected Carlo, they did not always understand the cost of keeping an empire invisible. Carlo knew that the real work of leadership in these years was not just managing the present, but preparing the future. He began to move pieces quietly, placing men in positions where they could be tested without them realizing it was a test. He wanted to see who could follow orders without needing constant supervision, who could solve problems without bringing trouble to his doorstep, and most importantly, who understood that power was safest when it didn't announce itself. He was still careful with his public presence. Even as a man in his 70s, he never paraded his wealth. His home, while comfortable, was modest by the standards of other bosses. He didn't wear flashy jewelry, didn't drive the newest cars, didn't host extravagant parties. This wasn't just humility, it was strategy. The less attention he drew to himself, the more freely he could move. He wanted people to think of him as a quiet old man who preferred his own company, while in truth he remained the silent conductor of a vast and complex orchestra. But time was making itself known in other ways. His health was no longer what it had been. There were days when his body felt heavy, his breath shorter than before. He had always maintained a certain discipline in his lifestyle, but age is the one opponent that no man can outmaneuver forever. He didn't speak of it openly, but in private moments he acknowledged that he might not have many years left at the helm. This made succession more than a passing concern. The Gambino family's strength came from unity at the top, and if there was confusion about who should lead after him, the resulting struggle could tear apart everything he had built. Choosing a successor in the underworld was not as simple as naming a favorite. It meant considering alliances, rivalries, and the balance of power not only within his own ranks but across the other families in New York. The wrong choice could invite war. Carlo's thoughts often returned to Paul Castellano, a man he trusted, a relative by marriage, and someone who understood the value of running things like a business rather than a battlefield. Castellano had proven himself competent in handling money, unions, and legitimate fronts. But Paul was not universally loved among the street-level earners. Some saw him as too removed from the rougher side of the life, too focused on the white-collar rackets. Carlo knew that if Paul was to lead after him, he would have to smooth over those resentments, or at least ensure that they couldn't turn into outright rebellion. Meanwhile, law enforcement pressure continued to grow. The RICO Act had become a tool federal prosecutors were eager to use, and several high-profile cases against other mob bosses were making headlines. Carlo saw each conviction as both a warning and a lesson. He doubled down on his rules about secrecy and compartmentalization. Fewer meetings, fewer middlemen, and fewer reasons for anyone to connect him directly to the family's operations. If anyone was going to survive this new era of law enforcement, it would be the man who gave them nothing to grab onto. Yet, for all his caution, Carlo still had to contend with moments of risk. In 1972, there was an attempt on his life, subtle, but enough to remind him that no one is beyond danger. A rival faction, sensing an opportunity, had moved against him through intermediaries. The plot was discovered and quietly dismantled before it could reach him, but the message was clear. There were still men out there willing to gamble everything for a shot at his throne. Carlo's response was not rage or public retribution. It was quiet, calculated pressure applied in ways that made the instigators regret they had ever considered crossing him. By the time it was over, the threat had vanished, not with gunfire, but with quiet erasure. Carlo's ability to remove an enemy without leaving a ripple had become almost legendary. Younger bosses tried to imitate it, but often failed because they lacked his patience. Where they wanted immediate displays of dominance, Carlo was willing to let time do the work for him. He would cut off resources, isolate a man's allies, make it harder for him to operate until he either bent the knee or disappeared entirely. As the years passed, Carlo spent more time in his home on Long Island, but that didn't mean he had withdrawn. Trusted men came to see him, often under the guise of social visits, bringing updates on business and seeking his quiet approval for certain moves. He rarely gave direct orders anymore. Instead, he asked questions that guided his lieutenants toward the decision he wanted them to make. This way, the men felt ownership over the choices, but in truth, they were still following his lead. Privately, Carlo was reflecting more often on the road that had brought him here. He remembered arriving in America as a young man, unknown and unimportant, navigating the dangerous waters of an underworld filled with men bigger, louder, and more violent than he was. He had survived by being different, by thinking further ahead, by speaking less, by allowing others to underestimate him until it was too late. Now, decades later, those same traits still defined his leadership. The old guard still alive and the other families respected him deeply. They understood the weight of what he had accomplished, leading for decades without serving prison time, without being taken out by rivals, without letting greed or ego destroy him. That kind of record was almost unheard of in their world. But Carlo knew that even the strongest reins end. In 1976, he began making the final arrangements for what would happen after he was gone. Meetings were held in absolute secrecy, decisions made behind closed doors with only a select few aware of the full plan. He wanted no public struggle, no open power grab. If everything went as he intended, the transition would be smooth, the family would remain strong, and his principles of quiet, calculated leadership would continue into the next generation. That autumn, his health worsened. The once steady walks grew shorter, the conversations more tiring. Yet he still received visitors, still offered counsel, still maintained the calm demeanor that had kept him in power for so long. He did not speak of death, but those closest to him sensed that he was preparing himself for it in his own way. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino passed away quietly at his home, surrounded not by the chaos that so often marks the end of a mob boss's life, but by the same quiet dignity with which he had lived it. There was no gunfire, no courtroom drama, no sudden collapse in the street. He simply left the stage as he had commanded it, on his own terms. The city's underworld paused for a moment in acknowledgement. His funeral drew not just his own men, but figures from across the country, each aware they were marking the end of an era. In the days that followed, Paul Castellano stepped into the role Carlo had prepared for him, and the Gambino family entered its next chapter. Whether Paul would maintain the same stability was a question only time could answer. Carlo Gambino's name would live on in whispers and in the quiet caution of those who studied his methods. He had shown that in a world obsessed with power, the greatest power of all was the ability to hold it without flaunting it, to control everything without appearing to control anything. And in the end, that was his true legacy. A blueprint for survival in a life where survival was the rarest victory of all. The late autumn of New York had a way of painting the city in muted shades. The trees in Central Park were almost bare, their leaves scattered by the wind, and the streets carried that faint chill hinting winter was near. In the quiet of his Long Island home, Carlo Gambino sat in his usual armchair, a thick wool cardigan over his shoulders, sipping coffee as he listened to the faint hum of life outside. By this point in his life, Carlo was no longer the young, sharp-eyed man who had arrived in America decades ago. His hair was thinner, his steps slower, but the sharpness in his mind was untouched. Even in his later years, his influence ran deep, touching everything from labor unions to quiet business arrangements that kept money flowing steadily. His leadership style, built on patience and subtlety, was still the defining force behind the Gambino family. Carlo's day often began early, before most of the city stirred. He'd read the paper carefully, not just the headlines, but the small articles that could signal shifts in politics, law enforcement attention, or business. To him, every piece of information was a puzzle piece. He rarely acted in haste. Instead, he stored these pieces away until the larger picture revealed itself. In the neighborhood social clubs, the talk was always respectful when his name came up. Younger men in the organization, many of whom had never sat face-to-face with him, still spoke about him with a mixture of admiration and quiet fear. He wasn't the kind of leader who had to yell or threaten. His decisions carried a weight that didn't require volume. They were understood, final, and most importantly, unquestioned. As the years passed, Carlo's business methods had shifted from the raw, street-level rackets of his early days to more sophisticated, less visible enterprises. Construction contracts, union negotiations, and investments in legitimate businesses all played into his larger vision. He knew that the less attention you drew, the longer you lasted, and Carlo's long tenure was living proof of that philosophy. Still, he understood that times were changing. Law enforcement was becoming more organized, pooling resources across states and sharing intelligence more effectively. Younger, flashier mob figures were making headlines. Men like John Gotti would, in later years, capture the public's fascination with their boldness. Carlo didn't approve of that approach. To him, fame was a weakness, not a badge of honor. But he also knew that the world wasn't going to move backward, and part of his skill had always been adapting without losing control. One evening, as the wind rattled the windows, Carlo hosted a small gathering at his home. It wasn't unusual for him to meet with trusted figures privately, away from the noise of the city. The group included longtime associates, men who had been with him through decades of quiet expansion and careful maneuvering. They sat around a polished wooden table, sipping espresso, the air filled with low conversation and the faint smell of cigar smoke. Carlo listened more than he spoke. He let others share their updates, small issues, potential disputes, opportunities for new ventures. When he did speak, it was often just a sentence or two, but those words would set the course for weeks or months to come. It was this ability to guide without seeming to control that had kept him at the top for so long. Outside his immediate circle, there were whispers in the underworld about succession. Carlo was nearing 80, and while he still appeared strong, nature respected no man's will forever. Who would take the reins when he was gone? That question lingered in the minds of many, and even in Carlo's own thoughts. He had his preferences, men he trusted, men who had earned their place not through ambition alone, but through loyalty and understanding of the family's values. One of those men was Paul Castellano, a relative by marriage and a figure who embodied Carlo's preference for quiet, business-minded leadership. But naming a successor was never a simple matter. It required balancing the family's stability, avoiding unnecessary conflict, and making sure no rival factions could exploit the transition. As the months passed, Carlo's movements became even more discreet. He spent less time in the city and more time in the calm of his Long Island residence. He still received visitors, always carefully chosen, always trusted, but his direct involvement in the daily operations began to step back, allowing his chosen figures to take on more responsibility. Even in his retreat, Carlo's influence could be felt in the way disputes were resolved without public flare-ups, in the way new business ventures quietly fell into place, and in the way law enforcement still seemed to struggle to connect him directly to anything criminal. He had built a life on the principle that power worked best when it didn't announce itself. One morning, as he sat reading in the sunlit corner of his living room, he thought back to his arrival in America. The crowded streets of the Lower East Side, the faces of those who had come with nothing but determination, the early risks he had taken, they all felt like chapters from another man's life. Yet here he was, decades later, a living testament to the idea that patience could outlast force. Friends and associates who came to see him noticed that he seemed to be in a reflective mood more often now. He would sometimes tell small stories from the past, not the kind that revealed secrets, but moments that carried lessons. About how losing your temper could cost you more than losing a deal. About how sometimes the smartest move was to do nothing at all. About the value of keeping your word, even in a world where trust was rare. As winter set in, the nights grew longer and quieter. Carlo often sat by the fireplace in the evenings, the glow casting soft light across his face, making him look even older yet somehow timeless. He knew his era was nearing its close, but he wasn't afraid. In his mind, he had lived exactly the way he intended, by his own rules, without bending to the vanity that had destroyed so many others. By the time the first snow fell that season, the conversations about succession had grown more urgent among his inner circle. Carlo never announced decisions quickly. He preferred to let them ripen, to see if people revealed their true selves when they thought power might be within reach. It was a quiet December evening when he finally began to make his intentions known. Sitting with Paul Castellano in a small study away from the others, Carlo spoke in his usual calm tone. He talked about the importance of protecting the family, of keeping business smart and discreet, of avoiding unnecessary wars. It wasn't a grand speech, but rather the passing of a philosophy, a final lesson from a man who had mastered the art of lasting in a dangerous world. The two men sat for hours, the crackle of the fire the only sound between their words. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a soft, silent blanket, a fitting backdrop for the careful transfer of a legacy built on silence, patience, and an unshakable will. The winter of that year seemed colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps deep into the bones and lingers. The streets of New York carried an icy hush, and even the city's usual clamor felt muted, as though the world itself was slowing down. In his Long Island home, Carlo Gambino moved a little more slowly these days. His once brisk steps were now measured, deliberate, but his mind, ever alert, remained untouched by age. Carlo had always lived with the understanding that nothing in his world was permanent, not alliances, not fortunes, not even life itself. Yet, as he sat in his familiar armchair near the window, watching the bare branches sway in the wind, he felt an unfamiliar weight pressing in on him. It wasn't fear. He had long ago accepted that life in his position came with no guarantees. It was more the awareness of time, how much had passed, and how little might remain. In the quiet hours of early morning, when the house was still and the sky just beginning to lighten, Carlo often found himself drifting into thoughts about the past. He thought of Sicily, the dusty roads and the smell of the sea, of his family, and the early lessons that had shaped him. He remembered his arrival in America, the cramped tenements, the struggles, and the first steps into the shadowy world that would define his life. Those memories were never romanticized in his mind. They were simply part of the path. Each choice, each alliance, each careful step had led him here, an old man who still commanded respect in a world that chewed through men twice as ruthless in half the time. But time was not a respecter of status. Carlo could feel his body tiring more quickly, even on days when his mind was sharp. He noticed the concerned glances from his wife, from close family members, and even from the men who came to report to him. He knew what they were thinking, that it was time to consider the future without him. The matter of succession had been hovering in the air for months, perhaps even years. For Carlo, it was not a decision to be rushed. Passing on leadership was not simply about naming someone. It was about ensuring the survival of a system he had spent decades building and protecting. Their conversation ended. The night had settled over Long Island. Carlo rose slowly from his chair, walked to the window, and looked out at the snow. In that moment, it was as if he were looking at both the past and the future, knowing that his own place in the story was nearly complete. The final weeks of Carlo's life were quiet but purposeful. He saw to it that certain arrangements were made, loose ends tied, and potential disputes addressed before they could ignite. Visitors came and went, some old friends, some family, all of them aware that they might be seeing him for the last time. He greeted them warmly, never showing weakness, as though to remind them that even in his final days, he remained the man who had guided them through decades of challenges. When the end finally came, it was without spectacle. Carlo passed in his sleep in the early hours of an October morning, the same way he had lived much of his life, quietly, without drawing attention. News of his death spread quickly, both in the world he had ruled and in the city beyond. For many, it marked the end of an era, the closing of a chapter defined by a leader who had mastered the art of survival. In the days that followed, the family moved forward under Paul Castellano's leadership, just as Carlo had intended. The transition was smooth, a testament to the careful groundwork he had laid. There were disagreements, as there always are, but no chaos. The rules, the philosophy, and the quiet strength that Carlo had instilled remained in place, at least for the time being. And so, Carlo Gambino's legacy endured, not in headlines or public displays, but in the continued existence of the structure he had built, in the lessons passed down to those who would carry his work into the future. His was a story not of loud victories, but of silent endurance, a life lived in the shadows yet casting a long and lasting influence on the world he had shaped. Under the weight of years and the changing tides of the underworld, Carlo Gambino's final chapter began to take shape with the quiet inevitability of a setting sun. He was older now, his once quick stride slower, his frame lean but more fragile, though his eyes still carried that sharpness, a flicker of calculation that never seemed to fade. For decades, he had steered the most powerful criminal organization in America, without the need for flamboyance or chaos. His was a reign built on patience, subtle influence, and a mastery of reading people before they had even spoken a word. But time, as it always does, was catching up. He knew it. Everyone did. And in his world, the end of a boss's time, whether by death, betrayal, or retirement, always opened the door to a dangerous shift in balance. By the mid-1970s, New York was not the same city he had inherited when he first rose to power. The streets had grown more unpredictable, the younger generation of mobsters less disciplined and more hungry for immediate rewards. Drugs had become a bigger temptation despite Carlo's strict orders to keep the family away from the trade. He saw it as poison, not just to the communities it destroyed, but to the men who dealt it. Drugs brought attention, federal heat, and sloppy violence. All things Gambino spent his life avoiding. Yet, for all his authority, he could feel the cracks forming. Younger capos and associates whispered about fast money, and while most obeyed, he knew that obedience was a delicate thing. It could shift overnight. Carlo's approach to these final years was not one of clinging to power at all costs. He had outlasted rivals, sidestepped wars, and negotiated truces when others would have chosen bullets. But more than anything, he understood that the real art of leadership wasn't just about ruling. It was about deciding when to step away and ensuring the right person took your place. A wrong decision in succession could undo decades of stability in months. He had already seen the chaos that followed when other bosses failed to. Their conversation ended. The night had settled over Long Island. Carlo rose slowly from his chair, walked to the window, and looked out at the snow. In that moment, it was as if he were looking at both the past and the future, knowing that his own place in the story was nearly complete. The final weeks of Carlo's life were quiet but purposeful. He saw to it that certain arrangements were made, loose ends tied, and potential disputes addressed before they could ignite. Visitors came and went, some old friends, some family, all of them aware that they might be seeing him for the last time. He greeted them warmly, never showing weakness, as though to remind them that even in his final days, he remained the man who had guided them through decades of challenges. When the end finally came, it was without spectacle. Carlo passed in his sleep in the early hours of an October morning, the same way he had lived much of his life, quietly, without drawing attention. News of his death spread quickly, both in the world he had ruled and in the city beyond. For many, it marked the end of an era, the closing of a chapter defined by a leader who had mastered the art of survival. In the days that followed, the family moved forward under Paul Castellano's leadership, just as Carlo had intended. The transition was smooth, a testament to the careful groundwork he had laid. There were disagreements, as there always are, but no chaos. The rules, the philosophy, and the quiet strength that Carlo had instilled remained in place, at least for the time being. And so, Carlo Gambino's legacy endured, not in headlines or public displays, but in the continued existence of the structure he had built, in the lessons passed down to those who would carry his work into the future. His was a story not of loud victories, but of silent endurance, a life lived in the shadows yet casting a long and lasting influence on the world he had shaped. Under the weight of years and the changing tides of the underworld, Carlo Gambino's final chapter began to take shape with the quiet inevitability of a setting sun. He was older now, his once quick stride slower, his frame lean but more fragile, though his eyes still carried that sharpness, a flicker of calculation that never seemed to fade. For decades, he had steered the most powerful criminal organization in America without the need for flamboyance or chaos. His was a reign built on patience, subtle influence, and a mastery of reading people before they had even spoken a word. But time, as it always does, was catching up. He knew it. Everyone did. And in his world, the end of a boss's time, whether by death, betrayal, or retirement, always opened the door to a dangerous shift in balance. By the mid-1970s, New York was not the same city he had inherited when he first rose to power. The streets had grown more unpredictable, the younger generation of mobsters less disciplined and more hungry for immediate rewards. Drugs had become a bigger temptation, despite Carlo's strict orders to keep the family away from the trade. He saw it as poison, not just to the communities it destroyed, but to the men who dealt it. Drugs brought attention, federal heat, and sloppy violence, all things Gambino spent his life avoiding. Yet for all his authority, he could feel the cracks forming. Younger capos and associates whispered about fast money, and while most obeyed, he knew that obedience was a delicate thing. It could shift overnight. Carlo's approach to these final years was not one of clinging to power at all costs. He had outlasted rivals, sidestepped wars, and negotiated truces when others would have chosen bullets. But more than anything, he understood that the real art of leadership wasn't just about ruling. It was about deciding when to step away and ensuring the right person took your place. A wrong decision in succession could undo decades of stability in months. He had already seen the chaos that followed when other bosses failed to prepare. The streets remembered the years of bloody disputes when leadership transitions were left to fate. Carlo had no intention of letting the Gambino family fall into that trap. He began quietly mapping out the future, weighing his options, and watching the men around him more closely than ever. There were contenders for leadership, men with ambition, influence, and respect, but each had his strengths and flaws. He kept his thoughts close, speaking to only a trusted few, knowing that even the smallest whisper could start a wave of maneuvering and betrayal. In these years, Carlo spent more time at his modest home in Massapequa, Long Island. Unlike the flashy mobsters who drove luxury cars and threw money around in nightclubs, Carlo's life was understated. His neighbors saw him as a polite, quiet man who tended to his garden and waved to the mailman. Few suspected that inside his walls were the conversations and decisions that shaped the very underworld of New York. He still held meetings, still gave his quiet approvals or disapprovals, but the pace was slower now. His mind was still sharp, but he could feel the weight of each year pressing harder. Despite his age, respect for him never waned. Men still rose when he entered a room, conversations paused, and eyes followed his every move. Even the newer generation, who had never known the wars of the past, understood that Carlo was not to be underestimated. His reputation as a man who could destroy an enemy without raising his voice had been etched into the foundation of the Mafia itself. Yet, in those quiet moments when he sat in his chair by the window, Carlo thought about his life in a way he never had before. He remembered the streets of Palermo where he was born, the long journey to America, the early years of struggle, and the battles fought not just with bullets, but with patience and strategy. He thought of the friends and enemies who had come and gone, of those who had died in prison cells or in alleys, and how he had survived them all, not because he was the strongest, but because he was the most careful. There were nights when his closest allies would visit, men who had been with him for decades. They would talk in low voices about the future, about the pressures from law enforcement, about the shifting alliances among the 5 families. The FBI had not stopped watching him, and though they had never been able to put him behind bars for long, their persistence was a reminder that even the most untouchable could fall. He had no fear of prison at this